The morning of August 18th, 1944, dawned over a field of burning wrecks somewhere near Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives, in Normandy. The air reeked of cordite and scorched metal, and the low fog clung to the twisted carcasses of tanks and trucks that only hours earlier had been part of the German 7th Army's retreat through what historians would later call the Falaise Pocket. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. From the east, the rising sun glinted off the silver fuselage of a lone P-51D Mustang limping toward Allied lines. Its left landing gear hung uselessly, jammed halfway down. The right one was sheared completely off. The pilot, Captain Robert Bob Hoover of the 352nd Fighter Group, held the stick steady with both hands, his knuckles white, his fuel gauges nearly on empty, and his right rudder pedal slack from damage sustained in a dogfight minutes earlier. Hoover's engine coughed once, twice, and then roared again, each sputter a reminder that the propeller blades ahead of him were barely balanced. Below him stretched a patchwork of liberated farmland and bombed villages. His radio had long gone dead, and his canopy was spider-webbed with bullet holes that refracted sunlight into shards across his oxygen mask. He had one choice left, and it wasn't in the manual. Make a low-altitude pass at an Allied airstrip so risky that ground crews would later call it suicidal, yet it might just make a crippled Mustang land without landing gear. To understand why Hoover, barely 22, would attempt such a maneuver, one has to understand the kind of men who flew the P-51 Mustang and the mindset of the air war over Europe in the late summer of 1944. The Allied breakout from Normandy was in full force. Every pilot in the 8th Air Force knew that time and momentum favoured them now, but attrition was still merciless. The average life expectancy of a fighter pilot over France was barely 3 weeks. The P-51 Mustang had changed the course of that air war. Introduced only the year before, it combined a British airframe with an American Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, giving it the range to escort bombers deep into Germany and the agility to outturn nearly anything it faced. To the pilots, the Mustang wasn't just a machine, it was a companion that might save their lives or kill them if they misjudged its temper. Bob Hoover had been flying since he was a teenager in Tennessee. Before joining the Army Air Forces, he had flown crop dusters and trained on every aircraft the service could throw at him. By 1943, he was flying reconnaissance and fighter escort missions over the Channel. What made him stand out wasn't aggression but control. Hoover had an instinctive understanding of aerodynamics, a gift that let him sense, almost by feel, how far an airframe could be pushed before it betrayed him. That instinct was about to be tested to its limit. The battle that morning had been brutal. The Luftwaffe, desperate to cover the German withdrawal from the Falaise Pocket, had thrown its remaining fighter strength into the air. Focke-Wulf 190 seconds and Messerschmitt 109 seconds, piloted by men as weary as they were fanatical. Hoover's flight had intercepted a formation over Argentan. The first pass went well, 2 enemy fighters downed, but then the sky dissolved into chaos. Tracers sliced through the air, and a 20mm cannon round slammed into Hoover's right-wing root, severing hydraulic lines and locking his landing gear halfway down. Another burst tore through the fuselage, knocking out his radio and punching holes in the radiator. He broke away, diving to low altitude to evade, his Merlin engine howling at full throttle. For 10 minutes, he skimmed treetops, the coolant temperature climbing past critical. The P-51's engine was a masterpiece of engineering precision, but without coolant, it was a time bomb. By the time Hoover crossed into Allied territory, the Mustang was barely holding together. He saw a makeshift landing strip carved out by engineers near the village of Lons-les-Abeilles. The field was short, rough, and crowded with parked aircraft. Attempting a belly landing here risked hitting fuel trucks or men working on the ground. Attempting a conventional landing was impossible, the uneven gear would cartwheel the plane. And so he decided to do the unthinkable. Hoover throttled back, eased into a low pass just feet above the runway. Observers later swore his propeller blades nearly clipped the grass. His plan was simple and insane. use the propeller wash and impact of the slipstream to slow the Mustang just enough to pancake it onto the field without flipping. He flew along the strip once to gauge the distance, then banked into a tight circuit. Every instinct told him this was madness. Fighter doctrine drilled into every pilot since flight school was clear: never attempt to land gear up at high speed, never risk a prop strike. Yet in that moment, logic gave way to intuition. Hoover had studied airflow, drag, and lift as deeply as any engineer. If he could bleed just enough speed without losing control, the Mustang's broad wings might cushion the impact. He rolled level, engine sputtering, the airspeed dropping below 100 miles an hour. Then, as the prop blades kissed the tips of grass, he chopped the throttle and pulled the stick full back. The impact came not as a crash, but as a controlled thud, the aircraft sliding across the grass in a shower of dirt and sparks. The belly tanks tore away, the wingtips scraped deep furrows, but the fuselage held. When the dust settled, Bob Hoover climbed out of the cockpit unhurt. The Merlin engine ticked and hissed as it cooled, steam rising from the shattered radiator. He had landed a crippled P-51 with no landing gear by, flying a suicidal low pass that no manual would ever recommend. In later years, engineers studying the incident would note that the Mustang's laminar flow wings, designed for maximum efficiency at high speed, provided just enough lift at the edge of stall to soften the touchdown. But the physics only explained the result, not the courage it took to try. For the men who watched from the field that day, the sight of a silver Mustang sliding to a stop without breaking apart became legend. It wasn't just skill, it was defiance. Defiance of fear, of mechanical failure, of the thin line between flight and fall. And yet, as Hoover himself later said, you don't do it because you're brave, you do it because there's no other way left. When the dust settled across the Normandy airstrip, silence followed. A few mechanics and ground crew, frozen moments earlier by the sight of a P-51 screaming toward them at head height, now broke into a run. The Mustang had come to rest in a shallow rut, nose slightly bent, propeller curled like a twisted ribbon of aluminum. Smoke rose from the radiator vents, mingling with the morning haze. Inside the cockpit, Captain Robert Bob Hoover unbuckled his harness, slid the canopy open, and stepped down onto the wing. His flight suit was soaked in sweat. A medic rushed up, expecting to find burns or broken bones, but Hoover was uninjured. His first words were calm, almost detached. "Somebody tell the crew chief I brought her back in one piece." The statement was not bravado. It was the reaction of a man whose body still hadn't caught up with what his mind had just done. Hoover's landing defied every principle of flight safety. To those who had witnessed it, the event bordered on impossible. Yet to Hoover, it was the inevitable result of understanding his aircraft so completely that instinct and physics had fused into one. The North American P-51D Mustang was a masterpiece of wartime engineering, a fusion of British aerodynamic theory and American manufacturing genius. At its heart was the Rolls-Royce Merlin V1650 engine, a liquid-cooled V12, capable of over 1,500 horsepower. Its laminar flow wings were revolutionary. They minimized drag by keeping the airflow smooth across the surface, allowing the Mustang to fly faster and farther than any other Allied fighter. However, that same wing design made the Mustang notoriously tricky to handle near stall speeds. Its lift dropped sharply once the angle of attack exceeded a critical point. Most pilots feared that threshold. Hoover studied it. He had spent hours experimenting with the aircraft's slow flight characteristics, trimming, gliding, and deliberately flirting with stall to feel exactly how the Mustang behaved at the edge of aerodynamic failure. When his crippled fighter began losing altitude over Normandy, he knew precisely how far he could push it before the wings stopped lifting. That knowledge, born not from manuals but from intuition and practice, made the difference between a catastrophic crash and a controlled landing. Aviation historians often divide pilots into two types: the tacticians and the feelers. Tacticians fly by numbers, feelers by instinct. Hoover was both. His instinct told him the Mustang's shape would cushion the impact if the speed was bled just right. His calculation told him that a full stall belly landing at 90 miles per hour was survivable if the aircraft remained level. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But even perfect control could not overcome the violent laws of motion. When the Mustang hit the grass, the propeller blades snapped instantly, the fuselage jolted forward, and Hoover's body slammed into the straps with the force of a truck collision. The landing gear wells absorbed the first shock. The belly tanks exploded in a flash of dust and fuel vapor, but didn't ignite. A single spark could have turned the field into an inferno. That it didn't was luck. Everything else was skill. The first man to reach the Mustang was Sergeant James Coulter, an aircraft mechanic from Birmingham. He later recalled, "I thought I was looking at a dead man. He came out calm as if he'd just parked it. We stood there staring at that plane, belly scraped, prop bent, one wing almost gone, and we realized we'd seen something we'd never see again." Others soon gathered around, cameras in hand, documenting what would become one of the most studied non-crash landings of the war. Engineers later examined the damage pattern and concluded that Hoover's touchdown angle less than 5 degrees was precisely what allowed the aircraft to skid rather than dig in. To anyone else, it would have been a miracle. To Hoover, it was a controlled risk. In the following days, rumors spread through the 352nd Fighter Group that a crazy Tennessee kid had landed a dead Mustang by flying it into the ground on purpose. Pilots debated whether it was skill, desperation, or divine intervention. Even his commanding officer, Colonel James Jim C. Clark, summoned Hoover to his tent. "What in blazes were you thinking, Bob?" Clark demanded. Hoover, ever composed, simply replied, "Sir, I was thinking about not flipping over." Clark paused, then burst out laughing. "Well, you didn't, and you just gave our mechanics a week's worth of stories." That humour masked a deeper respect. The 352nd Fighter Group, nicknamed the Blue-Nosed Bastards of Bodney, prided itself on precision flying and discipline. For one of their own to pull off such an audacious manoeuvre reinforced what their leader, Colonel George Preddy, often said: "Confidence isn't arrogance when you've earned it." A post-flight analysis conducted by maintenance officers revealed fascinating details. Hydraulic failure, caused by a 20mm shell rupture near the wing root, disabling landing gear control. Propeller impact. All 4 blades bent backward evenly, proof that Hoover had touched down level. Structural integrity. The fuselage remained intact. Main spars showed no warping. Pilot injury report, none. It was, in essence, a perfect crash. Hoover's aircraft was salvaged for parts, and the incident was quietly logged under non-combat mechanical damage. Officially, it never made headlines. But among pilots, it became whispered legend, a lesson in what it meant to truly fly a machine rather than simply operate it. For all his composure, Hoover later admitted that in those final seconds before touchdown, he felt something close to transcendence, a state where fear vanished and only pure calculation remained. "It wasn't bravery," he said years later. "It was like time slowed down and every motion mattered. I could feel the air pushing against the wings like hands." Modern psychologists studying high-performance pilots call this the flow state, a neurological phenomenon where training and instinct merge, producing reaction times beyond conscious thought. Hoover, without knowing the term, had lived it. That state of mind would later define his post-war career as one of the world's greatest test pilots and airshow performers. But in 1944, it was simply the mindset of survival. When night fell that day in Normandy, Hoover sat alone beside his damaged P-51. Mechanics were already pulling panels and inspecting the wrecked propeller. In the dim light, the silver fuselage bore streaks of mud and oil, its once proud blue nose dulled by grit. He reached up and patted the side of the aircraft, the same ritual every pilot performed after returning from a mission. "You did good, girl," he whispered. The moment captured the essence of air combat in the Second World War, a man and his machine, bound by mutual trust and the thin hope that one would carry the other home. The field at Lonlay-l'Abaye became quiet, again after Hoover's miraculous landing. Within days, mechanics stripped the crippled P-51 for salvage, and the pilot who had defied gravity was reassigned to a fresh machine, another silver Mustang with the familiar blue nose of the 352nd Fighter Group. To the men who saw him fly, Hoover seemed untouchable. Yet he knew better than anyone that luck was temporary currency in aerial war. The sky over Europe was still hostile territory. By early September 1944, the Allies had pushed through France toward the Siegfried Line. The 352nd was now flying out of forward fields near Belgium, escorting B-17 and B-24 bomber formations into the industrial heart of Germany. The Luftwaffe was bloodied, but far from broken. Hoover's new aircraft, a gleaming P-51D5, bore the nose art Ole Yeller 2 and the same call sign Cajun 2-2. He resumed his routine, pre-flight at dawn, a long-range escort over smoke-choked skies, and endless hours of tension broken by seconds of combat. Each sortie blended exhaustion with hyper-focus. Pilots learned to live on adrenaline, coffee, and superstition. Hoover's superstition was simple. Never leave the ground without tapping the left side of the cockpit twice for luck. On the 9th of February 1945, Hoover's unit took off to escort bombers striking rail yards near Kassel. Clouds hung thick at 20,000 feet, visibility poor, the kind of weather that could hide a whole squadron or an ambush. Halfway through the run, radar picked up enemy contacts closing fast. Moments later, grey-green Focke-Wulf 190 burst from the clouds. The sky erupted in criss-crossing tracer fire. Hoover rolled hard right, diving to gain speed. A 190 streaked past his nose. He fired a 1-second burst hits across the fuselage. The German plane spiraled downward, trailing smoke. But another 190 slipped in from above, cannon shells tearing through Hoover's tail section. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit. His control stick went sluggish, the aircraft vibrating violently. A second burst shattered the canopy. Hoover's hand shot to the emergency lever. The Mustang lurched. Fire licked at the floorboards. "I didn't bail out," he would later recall. "I was thrown out." He parachuted through sleet and silence, the burning wreck of his Mustang tumbling behind him. When he landed in a frozen field, German farmers were already running toward him with rifles. His pistol was gone. Resistance was futile. Within an hour, Wehrmacht soldiers marched him to a nearby village, then by truck to interrogation centres near Frankfurt. From there, he was transferred to Stalag Luft I, a prisoner of war camp on the Baltic coast near Bath. Life in captivity was grey monotony punctuated by fear. Hoover joined hundreds of Allied airmen crammed into wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire. Rations were thin, the cold relentless. Yet morale survived through defiance lectures, makeshift radios, and endless escape planning. For Hoover, captivity was intolerable not because of hardship, but because it denied him flight. He was, at 23, a pilot whose purpose was stolen. He began plotting his way back into the sky. By April 1945, Germany was collapsing. Guards were nervous, supplies short. Rumors spread that the Soviets were advancing from the east. Amid the confusion, Hoover and a few companions saw opportunity. When an Allied bombing raid shook the camp one night, he slipped out through a broken fence section, crawling into nearby woods. For 3 days he moved only at night, scavenging food from abandoned farms. Eventually he stumbled upon a small Luftwaffe airfield, unguarded except for a few mechanics preparing to flee. Parked on the edge of the runway was a half-fueled Focke-Wulf 190, one of the very fighters that had once hunted him. Hoover's first thought was insanity, his second was inevitability. If he could fly a crippled Mustang, he could steal an enemy plane. He waited until dusk, then crept onto the tarmac. The aircraft was intact, engine warm. He climbed into the cockpit, familiar yet alien, the gauges in German, the levers reversed. He had never flown a 190 before, but he had studied its flight manual after interrogations months earlier. He pressed the starter. The BMW radial engine coughed, then roared to life. Mechanics burst from a nearby hut, shouting, but Hoover slammed the throttle forward. The 190 surged down the runway, bullets snapping past. Moments later, the German airfield fell away beneath him. He was airborne again, this time in enemy colours. "It was the sweetest sound I ever heard," Hoover said later. Freedom had a propeller. He flew west, hugging treetop level to avoid friendly flak. Navigation was by instinct and fading daylight. Twice he circled to avoid columns of German troops. Finally, after nearly 30 minutes, he saw the white stars of an Allied airfield outside the city of Venlo, Netherlands. Fearing he might be mistaken for an attacker, he rocked the wings, cut the throttle, and glided in with the gear down. Allied gunners hesitated, then held fire. The Focke-Wulf touched down roughly but intact. When Hoover climbed out in a torn POW uniform, the ground crew stared in disbelief. One mechanic shouted, "You're out of your mind, Yank. You just landed a Jerry plane." Hoover grinned. "I couldn't find a Mustang," he said. After medical checks and interrogation to confirm his identity, Hoover was debriefed and sent home. The war in Europe ended weeks later, but his legend had already spread. The American pilot who had landed a Mustang without gear and later escaped Germany by stealing a Focke-Wulf. What began as a suicidal low pass in Normandy had come full circle, a journey from precision flying to survival, from captivity to liberation. In peacetime, Bob Hoover became one of the most celebrated test and airshow pilots in aviation history. His routines, loops, rolls, and dead-stick landings performed in civilian Mustangs and twin-engine Shrike Commanders would inspire generations. Every maneuver was rooted in the lessons of that war: control, instinct, and absolute trust in one's machine. When journalists asked years later which moment defined him, Hoover didn't mention the airshows, nor the fame. He only smiled and said, "The day I landed that Mustang without wheels, I learned what flying really meant. The day I stole that Focke-Wulf, I learned what freedom feels like." When the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May of 1945, the airfields that had once trembled under the thunder of bombers became strangely quiet. For men like Robert A. Bob Hoover, who had lived every waking moment by the rhythm of takeoffs and landings, the silence was both relief and uncertainty. He had survived what so many did not. He had escaped a German prison camp, stolen an aircraft from under the noses of his captors, and returned to Allied lines in one of the most audacious acts of individual flight in the Second World War. But survival was not the same as peace. Hoover was 23 years old, and though his body bore the marks of captivity and exhaustion, his mind was sharper than ever. The chaos of war had done something paradoxical. It had stripped away fear. Once a man has stolen an enemy aircraft and flown it through flak corridors at treetop height with no landing gear and no identification, there are few things left in life that can intimidate him. What remained was an insatiable curiosity, an engineer's hunger to understand why aircraft behaved as they did and how much further they could be pushed. In the summer of 1945, after his return to Allied control, Hoover was debriefed by intelligence officers who wanted every detail of his escape. The P-51 Mustang, his original aircraft, had been lost months before. The one he returned in a German Focke-Wulf 190 was a prize of intelligence, briefly examined by American engineers before being written off as too damaged for long-term study. Yet what caught the attention of senior officers wasn't the stolen plane itself, but Hoover's composure. His report was clear, methodical, free of bravado. He described control pressures, fuel estimates, and engine response with the precision of a test log. Someone in the chain of command took note. This young lieutenant had a brain wired for flight analysis. By 1946, Hoover was back in the United States and assigned to Wright Field in Ohio, the nerve center of post-war American aviation research. The U.S. Army Air Forces, soon to become the independent United States Air Force, was transitioning from piston-driven warbirds to jet-powered prototypes. It was a revolution as dramatic as the shift from biplanes to monoplanes 20 years earlier. Engineers were grappling with new aerodynamic phenomena, compressibility, transonic drag rise, and the mysterious barrier they called the sound wall. Pilots were needed who could take experimental aircraft beyond known limits and bring back data rather than wreckage. Bob Hoover was one of them. He joined a cadre of flyers who would become legends: Chuck Yeager, Jack Ridley, and later Scott Crossfield and Neil Armstrong. But Hoover's path was slightly different. He was not the one who broke the sound barrier first. That honor went to Yeager, but he was the one Yeager trusted with his life. When Yeager's X-1 rocket plane needed to be hauled to altitude beneath the belly of a B-29, it was Hoover who flew the mothership. When Yeager broke 2 ribs in a horseback accident just before the historic Bell X-1 flight, it was Hoover who helped him into the cockpit, fastening the hatch with quiet competence and a wry grin. The partnership between Hoover and Yeager became the stuff of aviation folklore. They complemented each other perfectly. Yeager, the intuitive natural, a combat ace with reflexes like a gunslinger. Hoover, the analytical tactician, an engineer pilot who could read airflow in the way a mathematician reads equations. Together, they represented 2 sides of the same coin: instinct and intellect, merged in service of a new frontier. Hoover's war had taught him something most test pilots would never experience firsthand: the brutal indifference of mechanical failure in combat. He had seen aircraft pushed past their limits, not in a laboratory but under fire. He knew how controls stiffened under high speed, how engines sputtered under negative G maneuvers, how pilots died when systems failed at the edge of performance. That perspective made him uniquely valuable. At Muroc Army Airfield, later renamed Edwards Air Force Base, Hoover became one of the few pilots authorized to test early jet aircraft, including the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star and the Republic F-84 Thunderjet. These machines were unlike anything that had come before. The old Mustang had responded to throttle changes like a living thing, prop wash curling around the fuselage in familiar turbulence. The new jets were smooth, relentless, and alien. Their thrust came not in pulses but in a continuous surge, and their wings, thin as razors, offered little warning before a stall. For many veterans of the propeller age, jet flight felt sterile, detached. Hoover saw something else, a new dimension of control waiting to be mastered. He approached the jets as he once approached the P-51, not as tools of war, but as instruments of art. Every flight, he believed, revealed a hidden grammar of motion. To understand it was to be free. By the late 1940s, Hoover was one of the Air Force's go-to pilots for evaluating captured enemy aircraft. He flew the German Me-262 jet, the British Meteor, and the early Soviet Yak designs recovered from Eastern Europe. Each was a lesson in engineering philosophy. The German machines were technically sophisticated but maintenance-heavy. The Soviet models, crude but rugged. Hoover's reports were concise and clinical, yet colleagues who flew with him recalled how he spoke of each aircraft with a kind of reverence. "Every airplane," he said, "has a soul. You can feel what its designer feared and what he hoped for." That attitude made him a bridge between 2 eras, the soldier who became a scientist without losing his humanity. When the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, predecessor to NASA, began recruiting test pilots for high-speed flight research, Hoover was among those invited. He served as chase pilot during Yeager's supersonic runs, filming data from the air, monitoring trajectory, and staying close enough to react if anything went wrong. The position required absolute trust. If Yeager's rocket plane failed to separate cleanly, Hoover's task would have been to risk collision and attempt rescue. It was the kind of suicidal backup plan only men of their generation could accept with calm resignation. The 1950s turned Hoover into an icon of precision flying, though he wore the title uneasily. What mattered to him was not fame, but demonstration showing what flight could be when stripped of spectacle and reduced to pure control. He began performing at air shows, initially to test aircraft handling for manufacturers, later as a means of inspiring the next generation. His signature routine became legendary, a full aerobatic sequence in a twin-engine business aircraft, the North American Rockwell Shrike Commander. He would take off, loop, roll, and stall the airplane deliberately, then recover it with the grace of a ballerina. Then, in an act that seemed to defy physics, he would shut down both engines mid-flight and continue to glide through a complete aerobatic pattern loops, barrel rolls, and a perfect dead-stick landing, coasting to the parking ramp so precisely that the propellers stopped at exactly the same angle. To the untrained eye, it was showmanship. To those who understood flight dynamics, it was mastery. Hoover was proving that safety and artistry were not opposites. His wartime experience surviving when machines failed and odds collapsed had taught him that absolute control came from humility before the laws of physics. He once told a young pilot, "Fly the airplane all the way to the crash." It was not a joke, it was a philosophy forged in fire. Behind the charisma and effortless precision lay decades of reflection. Hoover often spoke about fear not its absence, but its management. "Courage," he said, "is knowing what not to fear." During one demonstration, when a sudden gust flipped his aircraft inverted barely 100 feet above the ground, he corrected instinctively, never raising his voice on the radio. Later, a reporter asked how he stayed calm. Hoover smiled. "After you've escaped from a POW camp and stolen a German fighter, a little turbulence doesn't seem worth panicking over." In 1955, he left active military duty and joined North American aviation as a civilian test pilot. There, he helped develop the F-100 Super Sabre, the first operational fighter capable of supersonic speed in level flight. He also contributed to test programs for the F-86 Sabre and the T-28 Trojan trainer. Yet, even as the machines grew faster and deadlier, Hoover's approach remained unchanged. Every aircraft was to be treated with respect, and every flight logged with precision. Engineers trusted his reports implicitly because they were detailed, honest, and unemotional. Through the 1960s and 70s, Hoover became the face of disciplined showmanship. He demonstrated energy management, the art of extracting every bit of kinetic and potential energy from an airframe to audiences worldwide. In an era when aviation was increasingly dominated by automation and electronic systems, Hoover's performances reminded pilots that the fundamental bond between man and machine still mattered. He often cited lessons from his Mustang days. "The P-51," he said, "talked to you through the control stick and the seat of your pants. It warned you before it stalled, whispered before it bit. Jets, by contrast, could be silent killers." The challenge for modern pilots was to develop new senses to feel through instruments what their bodies could no longer perceive directly. "You can't bully an airplane," Hoover liked to say. "You have to persuade it." Despite his celebrity, Hoover remained humble. He declined lucrative offers to commercialize his image, preferring to mentor younger pilots instead. Those who met him in the hangar at Van Nuys Airport in California described a man who would spend hours explaining aerodynamics with the enthusiasm of a teacher. He never boasted about his wartime escape unless asked, and even then, he minimized it. "I was just trying to get home," he would say. In 1986, the Federal Aviation Administration temporarily revoked his medical certification, claiming possible health concerns. The aviation community erupted in protest. Pilots from around the world, military, commercial, and civilian, signed petitions demanding his reinstatement. They argued, correctly, that Hoover remained one of the safest and most competent aviators alive. The ban was eventually overturned, but the incident underscored a larger truth. Bob Hoover had become more than a pilot. He was a living symbol of professional integrity in an age when bureaucracy often eclipsed skill. By the time he retired from active flying in the late 1990s, Hoover had accumulated more than 35,000 flight hours in over 300 different types of aircraft. His contributions were recognized with nearly every major aviation honor: the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Wright Brothers Memorial Trophy, and induction into the National Aviation Hall of Fame. Yet what mattered most to him were not the medals, but the young men and women who came up after him, many of whom cited Hoover's example as their inspiration. In his later years, reflecting on the arc of his life, Hoover often returned to that day over Germany when everything seemed lost. The crippled Mustang, the smoke-filled cockpit, the desperate glide toward Allied lines, those memories had not faded. They had become his compass. "That was the day," he once said, "I learned that an airplane will forgive you everything except panic." The phrase became his credo. It distilled a lifetime of experience into one sentence. Panic, in his view, was the only true enemy of flight, the moment when reason surrendered to fear, when training collapsed under pressure. Everything else, damage, weather, malfunction, could be managed, so long as the pilot kept thinking. As the Cold War gave way to the modern aerospace age, Hoover's influence reached far beyond the cockpit. NASA engineers cited his flight reports as examples of qualitative data observations that revealed what instruments could not. Test pilots at Edwards Air Force Base continued to pass down his methods: precise note-taking, clear communication, and a refusal to assign blame before understanding cause. In the end, Bob Hoover's legacy was not just about flying skill, but about mindset. He bridged the gap between war and peace, between chaos and order, between the instinct of survival and the discipline of science. His life formed a single continuous flight path from a suicidal low pass in a crippled Mustang to the serene grace of a dead-stick landing performed before thousands. Each phase illuminated the same truth: mastery is not the absence of danger, but the acceptance of it with clarity. When Hoover passed away in 2016 at the age of 94, tributes came from across the world. Pilots performed missing man formations in his honor. NASA posted a simple statement: "Bob Hoover showed us what flight could be." At his memorial, Chuck Yeager, his lifelong friend and fellow pioneer, summed it up in one line: "If you can fly like Bob, you're the best there is." The story of his wartime escape had come full circle. The young lieutenant who once risked everything to land a stolen enemy aircraft without gear had become the elder statesman of aviation, a man who proved over 70 years that calm, courage, and technical mastery were two sides of the same coin. In every sense that mattered, the suicidal low pass had never ended. It had merely become a metaphor, the eternal glide between peril and control, between chaos and composure. And as long as aircraft lift into the sky, carrying those who dare to trust their wings, the echo of that glide will remain steady, deliberate, unafraid. The airshow field shimmered under the Californian sun, a mirror of the endless skies that had defined Bob Hoover's life. The crowd stretched across the tarmac, cameras raised, children perched on shoulders. Before them stood a sleek, cream and green Rockwell Shrike Commander, its engines silent, waiting. Hoover, now in his 70s, ran his hand across its fuselage with the same affection he once reserved for his Mustang. It was no longer about war, or even fame. It was about showing the world what mastery of flight truly meant. He climbed aboard, pulled the canopy shut, and the engines came alive with a deep, throaty hum. The crowd hushed as the plane began to roll. Hoover lifted off smoothly, rising into the clear blue, and for a moment, all those decades, Normandy, captivity, the Focke-Wulf escape, seemed to dissolve into the air itself. What followed was a performance that defied logic and redefined flight. He rolled the twin-engine Shrike upside down, then poured iced tea into a glass without spilling a drop. He looped, rolled again, and performed a perfect 8-point hesitation roll, all while keeping the same altitude within a foot. Then, in silence, he shut down, both engines at 2,000 feet, feathered the props, and began a long, dead-stick glide. The plane danced gracefully, turning and descending in complete control until it kissed the runway precisely on centerline, both engines still off. The crowd erupted. To the untrained eye, it was a daring stunt, but to Hoover, it was something deeper, a message. Skill, discipline, and understanding could conquer fear. The same principles that saved him over France now defined his philosophy of aviation. "A pilot should fly with his heart as much as his hands," he often said. Machines obey respect. After retiring from active military testing, Hoover devoted his life to mentoring young pilots. He became a fixture at aviation schools, military academies, and airfields around the world. His lessons weren't about fame or heroics, they were about precision and humility. He told cadets stories from his war days not to glorify combat, but to emphasize judgment under pressure. He'd describe the moment he landed his crippled Mustang, how calm thinking, not bravado, made survival possible. "Don't ever let fear paralyze you," he'd tell them. "You can't control what breaks, but you can always control how you react." His philosophy soon became a cornerstone of advanced flight safety programs. NASA and the Air Force invited him to speak about situational awareness and instinctive control. The FAA later used his insights to develop new emergency procedure training modules. Bob Hoover, once a young fighter pilot defying death, had become aviation's elder sage. Away from the runway, Hoover was modest, almost self-effacing. He never boasted about his medals or fame. To friends, he was simply Bob, the man who'd stop to help a mechanic fix a stuck valve or listen patiently to a rookie's first flight nerves. He refused to see himself as a hero. When interviewers pressed him about courage, he smiled and deflected. "I just loved flying," he'd say. And, when you love something enough, you fight to keep it. But those who knew him understood the depth of that love. They'd seen him sit alone at dusk beside his aircraft, tracing the horizon with his eyes, whispering almost to himself. It wasn't nostalgia, it was communion. Every takeoff was a conversation with his past, the crash in France, the escape from captivity, the stolen Focke-Wulf. They weren't ghosts to him, but reminders of what flight had demanded and returned. In 1994, during an air show at Oshkosh, Hoover performed what he would later call his quietest flight. Midway through his demonstration, he throttled down the engines, let the Shrike glide silently, and banked gently over the crowd. The announcer's voice faded, replaced by a reverent hush. For 30 seconds, the only sound was wind over wings. It was his tribute to fallen pilots, to comrades who never came home, to the machines that carried them. When he landed, the crowd stood in complete silence, then burst into applause that lasted several minutes. For many, it was more than a performance, it was a eulogy written in air. In later years, honours flowed like contrails: the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal, the Wright Brothers Memorial Trophy, and enshrinement in the National Aviation Hall of Fame. Astronauts like Neil Armstrong called him the greatest stick and rudder man who ever lived. Chuck Yeager said simply, "If you can't do it like Bob, don't do it at all." Yet, for all the accolades, Hoover measured success differently. He valued the letters from young aviators more than the medals, the ones that began, "Because of you, I never gave up during my first spin recovery." He kept those letters in a box near his flight jacket, reading them before long trips. In 2015, at age 93, he made his final public flight. It was short, a gentle climb and landing at the Van Nuys airport, but symbolic. When he stepped out, thousands cheered. He looked up at the sky, smiled, and said softly, "It's been a beautiful ride." When Bob Hoover passed away in 2016, tributes poured in from across the globe. Pilots flew missing man formations, leaving an open space in the sky. Airfields dimmed their lights for 30 seconds of silence. Even NASA's flight operations paused briefly to honor him. But perhaps the truest tribute came from those who took to the air the next morning. They flew with steadier hands, clearer focus, and greater respect for the machines beneath them. They didn't need a monument. They carried his lessons in their instincts. In aviation museums, children now stand before his P-51 Mustang replica, reading the inscription. He taught the world that flight is not about defying gravity, it's about mastering it. And somewhere beyond the clouds, one imagines Hoover still at the controls, executing another perfect role, watching the horizon unfold beneath him. Because legends don't fade. They ascend. History remembers Bob Hoover as a pilot, an innovator, a teacher, But perhaps his greatest legacy is philosophical, that courage and grace are not opposites, but partners. His life stitched those words together across time and sky. Every low pass he made, every glide in silence, every controlled maneuver, was a meditation on what it means to trust completely in the self, the machine, and the invisible lift of air. To fly, for Hoover, was never about escaping Earth. It was about understanding it from above, its fragility, its beauty, its constant motion. And so, long after the engines quieted and the crowds went home, one truth remains written across the sky. Freedom is not the absence of danger, it's the mastery of it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.